Masculinity. And for those of you listening, I want you to know that Gayle has been on my show before, and so somehow things got mixed up, but I'm glad she's available now because her book on masculinity is absolutely incredible because she interviewed 33 men from different countries. Gayle, you are so prolific in everything that you do. It's just amazing to me how you even get the time together to do all of this research. You have taken on so many different projects. What made you decide that you wanted to research masculinity? I mean, there are so many attitudes relative to this. Why did you take on this challenge?
Well, Donna, it's good to talk with you. I love our conversations. I taught women's studies for decades. I was the first women's studies coordinator, helped develop the program at California State University, Chico. And it's very clear to me that we don't move towards equality between men and women without men being part of the process. It doesn't work to have two hands needed to clap. One hand can't do it. And so I organized different workshops on equality between men and women, and we did a videotape on male-female relationships, barriers and bridges that are on my YouTube channel. And so that was decades ago. And so I wanted to touch base again with some of those men like Warren Farrell and Jack Tamer that are well-known authors. And I wanted to see if they think progress has occurred, where are we now in terms of equality. And so, you know, I love interviewing people just like you do. So I interviewed them, and I also wanted to include men from different age groups, different countries. Everything I do now, I want an international perspective because we're such a global society. So I wanted to check in with men and see what progress we've made.
One of my concerns, and this has to do with so many of what I call the political footballs, there are so many individuals in various prominent positionings that are really fighting like crazy. And this is men and women both, of keeping old modalities that really should not apply. I mean, I'm looking forward to when it doesn't make any difference what color you are, what sex preference you have. You're a human being. If you're going in for a job, if you're the best qualified, you get it. If you don't, then, hey, you don't get it. We have gone through so many centuries, thousands of years, literally, and this paradigm of shift that we're experiencing is really a hard one for a lot of people to follow because depending on the society you speak to, you'll find that there are categories in the Asian society, depending on what aspect of the Asian society you go into, whether it's Japanese, Chinese, Taiwanese, it doesn't make any difference. They all have certain protocols. We, in the Western world, the same thing. And there are those social modalities, and it can come from a religious environment, it can come from a social environment, it can come from a schooling environment. And I would say, and please correct me if you have a different view, since the 60s, we have gone through so many roller coaster experiences with, well, this is not right, this is wrong. And I think men really got thrown off the bus. And it was as if they just, the women were coming forth, and I'm not saying that was wrong. I think it's long overdue. But I think men felt that they had lost, quote unquote, their boundaries or their paradigms that they had been taught, and they just sort of floundered. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I have two thoughts. One, I just want to say that historically, human beings have been hunters-gatherers who were very equal. They didn't have patriarchal families and head men and that kind of thing. And men and women shared the band's work of child care and getting food. They had different tasks, but they didn't look at as one sex as superior. So that's 98% of human history. We were hunters and gatherers that were pretty equal in our attitudes towards each other. So you could argue that, in fact, the conservative dominant pattern is to be cooperative rather than hierarchical with dominators. So that's one thing. The other is, I agree with you that I don't think men have been thrown off the bus, because they still are most of our members of Congress and president and Supreme Court and heads of boards of corporations and corporation leaders. So in this country and around the world, men are running the show. So I don't think you can argue with that in terms of statistics. But I agree with you that Warren Farrell calls it the boy crisis, and finds that boys, well, the fact is that, for example, university students are 60% young women. Young women are more likely to graduate from university and go on to graduate school. So I agree with you that there's a kind of a lostness maybe in young men, and they hear the future is female, or, you know, women are harder workers or whatever, and they get blamed for some of the violence against women that happens. So I think Warren Farrell's point is that the way to deal with this is boys and adolescents need male role models. And actually, there's a Harvard professor who's doing research on that, and he found that boys who are raised by single mothers don't do as well as their sisters, or as boys who have a lot of contact with their fathers. It makes sense to me that if I'm trying to figure out how to be a good man, it helps me to be around good men. So Farrell's argument is that the problem is not feminism, the problem is divorce, or parents who never were really parenting together, living together. So his approach is kind of interesting, which is to teach couples how to resolve conflict so they stay together, so that they are both parenting their children, because children need both male role models and female role models.
I agree with that. I really do. I have, in my years of being a counselor, I have encountered so many women that have sons. And after they reach a certain age, they honestly do not know how to deal with them. They don't, and they don't have male role models around. And now if they're lucky enough where the kid has a coach or is involved in sports where there is, where there's good male role models. I've done some fabulous interviews with men that are coaches and are teachers, and they see the need for young boys, for boys to be able to have a good example. And regardless of ethnicity, the color of the skin doesn't make any difference. They need it. And that is why in a lot of your old cultures, the men, let's say in a village, would take the young boys, and they would be, I think it was in the Chinese culture, it was in Aboriginal culture, it was in a number of island cultures, and even the Native Americans. Their culture was you're with your mother up until the time you're about 4 or 5 years of age, and then they are with the men. And the men work with the boys, teaching them the responsibility of what they need to do, and, as you said, the hunter-gatherer thing, how to hunt, how to defend, how to do things. But you had to have the understanding of what ethics were. You had to realize your word was your bond. So a lot of this, many men are stepping up to this, and they're saying, we've got to work together. And I really would love to see it so that women would not be so fearful, about the men that would be in their lives, that's something that I think most women want to have, men that they can, one, communicate with, and two, where they're not going to be ignored or isolated or, talked down to the way it has been for so many centuries. They want to have that appreciation. And this is something both the males and the females need to understand. You got to work together as a team. And
right.
That's important.
One of the men that I interviewed for the Global Dialogue on Masculinity's book, I think this is so smart. They, in their tribe, they have an older family member who's assigned as a mentor to the young couple. Excuse me. So before they get married, they're prepared. This is how you communicate. This is how you have, a happy sex life. This is how you resolve problems. And this mentor stays with them throughout the marriage. So if they have a conflict situation, they can go to their prospective mentors, the bride and the groom, and get help and support. So I think it's very hard for us in really isolated nuclear families where we don't have that kind of mentorship from adults. And I also want to say that another man that I interviewed who's in the book, the Global Dialogue on Masculinity in Kenya, he did have that initiation ceremony, but it was very hazardous for him because after they went through the ceremony, the ritual, the circumcision at age 12 or so, they were not allowed to live with any female family members. They had to live in their own little place, and they had very strict rules about how they could communicate or talk with their mom. And so it was a very painful experience. So, there has to be some kind of moderation in those initiation rituals.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, we're talking about different peoples and different cultures, and and this is something that I think is evolving. There are some men that are saying, I want to be more involved with the children. Now, Denmark is a country that you had some very interesting conversations with, and they are known for having, as the research has indicated, some of the happiest people on the planet. And the men have a different attitude towards the women in some respects, not in all. But it is the family and the raising of children, and the boys and the girls often are treated with equality. I mean,
well, that's true for all the Scandinavian countries, and it's so interesting that, as you say, they do score highest on the happiness scales. And part of that is we are so stressed out because we don't have affordable quality child care. We don't have parental leave. We don't have father's leave in this country. And so the people who come here from Scandinavia are so shocked that Americans are so stressed, so anxious, not very happy, worried, and they don't have to worry about life. They have social supports from cradle to grave. And do they pay higher taxes? Yes. But it's worth it. You have free college, you have good quality child care, elder care, health care. You don't have to think you're going to go bankrupt if you have a disease like cancer or something. So they are happy because they have support systems. They're not so stressed. And then that allows for men to take time off work. We don't have that in this country. Mm-hmm. We don't have any mandated paid family leave. I mean, it's tragic that I could have a cesarean section and have to go back to work in a month or something, I mean, and then I'm trying to nurse the baby, and there's no facilities for pumping, and I mean, it's no wonder that that 45% of the marriages are going to end in divorce. It's so stressful. Mm-hmm. We don't have those mentors. We don't have the leave policies, the knowing that our kids are in quality child care that we can afford. It's an unhealthy system.
Well, and I think that that is something that's evolving in this country little by little. I know that there are some businesses that want to make sure that their female employees are going to be able to have child care. There are a few businesses that actually have established, now they're in the minority, believe me, but they have established a system where the mothers on their lunch hour could go visit their children, and you know, they know that their children are safe. And there are so many single women, and having been a single parent myself, those stresses are just astronomical because, you know, you just are not able to do everything. And I really think that those support systems, as you say, are so important, but that's where integrating, I think, the elder population. People, I was visiting with someone today that her absolute passion is working with kids. And this is a woman in her senior years, and she just works with kids, and it's just wonderful. It just invigorates her. Well, it's those people, male and female both, that children need to have around them.
Yes.
And that is, gee whiz, you look at the early pioneers of this country, often families were all together. The grandparents were with the parents were out in the fields working, and the grandparents were watching the children at home.
Right.
You know, that was a long time ago. In today's world, people are having to drop their kids off at child care centers. It's even hard finding a nanny, if you will, someone that will be in your home, and it's all economics. Look at what we've gone through with COVID. So we have all these challenges. But I really appreciated, and of course we're not going to be able to talk about all 33 men, but I appreciated the commentary that you had with Ashanti Branch. He is very much engaged in support groups for boys of color. And this is something that, you know, he lost his dad when he was quite young.
Yeah.
And he was in, what was it, Arkansas? And this
well,
is
they were in Oakland, and his father died in Oakland, but was planning to move to the South to set up a new business.
All right, so they were on the West Coast. Here he is. His dad dies, and you go into the details on that. But this is a smart guy. He is really, really smart. And yet, when his dad died, it was, you got to take care of your siblings. And I was having a discussion with someone today who had to take care of their siblings when they were growing up, when they were just very young, just like him. And this is something that happens in different cultures all over the world. And as a male, he felt, you know, like he had been left out. He even felt that his mother was distant from him. And all of this, but what he's accomplished and what he's doing is absolutely phenomenal.
Well, I invite listeners to look on my YouTube channel, because you'll see the interviews with those men who are interviewed in the book and other books, and you get to know Ashanti Branch and see how charming and delightful he is. And by the way, it's interesting to me that he hasn't had children. Sometimes friends, people I know who were the oldest sibling and responsible, they don't want to have kids themselves. Not that he doesn't want to, but he hasn't. But because he's parented so many teenagers, as a math teacher, he started this program in his classroom at lunchtime where he encouraged boys to go on to school and to make something of themselves. So, yeah, I think it's worth seeing the video interview with Ashanti Branch on my YouTube channel.
Well, what he made a comment about was encouraging the boys in his club to go on to college. And he said 93% of those boys that were in his classes ended up going to college or entered into the military or went to a trade school, and they got educated. And it's often been said education is the key to financial freedom and to a better life. And we know that when you're in poverty, you don't even know how to get out of it if you don't have any kind of an education. There are no options. You won't see options. And it's a real tough space to be in. But he said, we can get out of the box. And I just think what he's done is absolutely phenomenal. And thank you for bringing up, the fact that you've got so many of these interviews on video so that people can see the people and they can also listen to the exchange of information that you share.
Right. But Ashanti brings us back to our original point that boys need male role models. And in this case, it doesn't have to be their father. It's their teacher, or as you said, their coach. So I think that's really an important point. And some of the men's advocates, the activists in the men's movement, have been pushing presidents in the last decades to have a White House Council on Boys, and they haven't been able to do that. So there's a White House Council on girls' issues, but not boys. And they would like to see that happen so we can really say, okay, how can we provide these kind of role models for boys? How can we encourage boys of color to think that being an academic is cool and not uncool like it is in some situations that Ashanti talks about?
Well, I think we've gone from one extreme to the other. For so many centuries, women were not even allowed to go to school. I mean, they were kept in, and it wasn't all that long ago that it was still going on.
Or they had quotas. We'll have 2% women in law school or whatever it was.
Yeah, and not permitted to be doctors. And, you could be a nurse, but forget it. If you wanted to be a surgeon or anything like this, no. Military, that is recent. And you look at the countries that have encouraged education for both the men and the women, and you say, okay, if you want to be a doctor, great. If you want to be a super gardener, master gardener, that's okay too. If you want to be a housekeeper, male or female, it doesn't make any difference. I remember here in the state of Washington an extensive article that was done on a man. This was a number of years ago, but he said, I'm being discriminated against. He said, I like cleaning houses. And women are so afraid of hiring me. They say, no, this is a woman's work. He said, baloney. I know how to clean a house, and I can do it faster than most of the women that I know that are cleaning houses. And he probably
there is
could.
Something to the fact that violence against women perpetrated by men is an issue. So, there's reason to be afraid of a strange man in your home.
Well, the thing is, though, he had, 5-star reviews on his work. So, again, and it's just like men being nurses. There are men that make wonderful nurses.
Sure.
So, we should say, all right, it doesn't make any difference whether you're male or female. If you do the job, if you're capable of doing it, then that's great. But you have to have, your standards. And look at what's happened in the military. The demeanor of attitude relative to women. And the abuse and the violence that has gone on there, but it's also gone on against the men. And that is something that is just coming out. And I've done, reports on that. I've interviews on that. And this is something that, we seem to go through extremes, and we need to come back to the middle of the road. We need to realize
the pendulum swings back and forth, and there's backlash and whatever. Yeah, that's true. And I do think that the misogyny of the Trump administration set a bad example for a lot of people. But on the other hand, it had motivated a lot of women and other people to work for equality and to, organize. So it was a double-edged sword.
Right. So we need to get rid of the double standards, I think, for both sexes. And I do think that there is that discrimination factor that oftentimes men do not address or do not speak to. And that is something that many times women are not aware of, that aspect. And this is something that I have seen. So
the old boys club. I'm going to go with people who are in my fraternity and I'm familiar with. I can cuss in front of them and not feel badly or be afraid they're going to accuse me of harassment or something.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
It's there. Now, you have a gentleman by the name of Gordon Clay. He's a very interesting man.
He is.
Because he's gone through so much. And what was interesting is that he was married to a woman that absolutely did not want anything to do with the daughter that came through their union. And he's in a court of law, and she's saying, I don't want the kid, give it to the father. And the judge just said, whoa, well, there was a time in American history only the men could have custody of the children. Women were not permitted to have them. So here we are in a situation where the judge goes, wait a minute, maybe I should put the kid in a foster home when the father could take care of the daughter. It is fascinating what we've gone through.
That was in Kansas, and it was 40 years ago, so I think it's changed, although there is a big branch of the women's movement that is devoted to having more fairness in terms of custody after divorce. So that's one of the major issues in the men's movement. Mm-hmm. But yeah, Gordon did end up with custody of his daughter. And I did a video webinar recently that's on the YouTube channel where some of the men in the book, we had a group kind of discussion. And on one of those webinars, Gordon Clay's daughter joined in. And she said how she was visiting with her mother and she got her menstrual period and she didn't talk to her mother about it because she waited till she was with her dad. Mm-hmm. And then he set her up with all the paraphernalia and whatever. So I thought, whoa, that's really something that you want to discuss that part of your life with your dad rather than your mom. That really spoke to me.
Yes, it does. And there is a commentary by him that I really liked. He said, and I'm going to quote directly from your book, I've yet to see a culture that doesn't, at some level, assign specific roles to men and other roles to women. I long to see an ism that is intent on creating a world where all jobs and duties are open to everyone based on their skill to perform the job, including all high-risk jobs, which generally pay more because of the high risk of death on the job. And I just say, yes. This, these are things that, and the points of information that he brings out, how in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, 5 out of the 6 maltreatment issues are perpetrated by women, 53 to 46%. And, I mean, there's so much statistical information, and yet it has been ignored. And I've known many men who have been wonderful with their children.
Oh, yeah.
Just absolutely fabulous with their children, and they're needed. And that is something that only, I think, men can teach to their sons. And I chuckle every time.
And their daughters. They're important for their daughters.
Yes, it's for both. And I chuckle when a friend of mine, when she had a son, she said, I'm going to make sure that he doesn't have, bows and arrows and none of the stuff that typically boys will go for. And it didn't work. He was every inch a boy. He was going to do what boys do. And she said, I wouldn't have thought it was that way. She had been indoctrinated that they need to be treated in what you would call a non-sex designation of any kind. And she found out he chose his stuff anyway. And
I did the same thing with my son. No guns. And so the boys would take sticks and go,
That's right.
They made the guns anyway.
That's right. And there is a distinct difference between the male-female. And there's just those dispositions. But it goes, for each of the sexes, if you will. And there will be those that are going to be artistic in the male side and have very soft qualities. There's going to be others that don't. It's not good or bad. It's just who they are as people.
Well, that's an interesting argument in both the men's and the women's movement in terms of theory is about gender. And some people emphasize that our gender roles are really socially constructed. They're taught to us by our environment. And then other people say, hey, wait a minute, we have hormones, we have some physiological differences, we have different genitalia, and we've got to take those kind of factors into existence. So they kind of argue over nature, nurture, which is most influential, which I think is an interesting discussion.
Absolutely. Gayle Kimball, we're out of time, and I want you to give your website quickly because people will find out about the YouTube videos and the other aspects of subject matter that we've covered. But your book, A Global Dialogue on Masculinity, 33 Men Speak Out, it is a phenomenal read. Give your website quickly.
www.gaylkimball.info, and the YouTube channel, just search Gayle Kimball YouTube.
All right, so that's Gayle Kimball, Kimball, GayleKimball.info?
Yeah, info.
All right, so there you've got it, and I have to say goodbye, Gayle, so